The stepping stones for the civil rights movement, the anti-lynching movement.
The civil rights movement during the 1960s was a revolution using social movements to end segregation, discrimination, and for gaining civil rights for African Americans. Years before this revolutionizing change could happen, there was drastic abuse against them and denial of rights. Taking a stand with the anti-lynching movement, which influenced what would become the civil rights movement, to finally face the injustice against them and change history. As the U.S. began to develop, more sources of labor were sought to help build a developing new country. This brought the idea of using humans from other countries and the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. During the mid-15th century, transportation of Africans to growing U.S. led to a booming economy with more labor being enforced and the making of raw materials. Years later, around the 1800s, slavery was still a huge part of the system. But the expansion of the U.S. and the moving of slaves to the south of the country had split into two, the North and the South. With different ideals, war broke out between the North and the South, with the North gaining the victory in abolishing slavery in those states. The 13th Amendment was created after the end of the Civil War, made to abolish slavery. It states, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." However, the amendment in place many were not in agreement. The life of African Americans did not improve and they were denied their rights. After the end of slavery, the neglect of African Americans was so horrid that a few viewed moving back to Africa as a better option. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves as of January 1st, 1863, though it caused backlash against African Americans as whites did not agree on giving them freedom and rights. With nowhere else to go, many stayed in the South and worked at the plantations as sharecroppers now, instead of as slaves. Senator Maybank was against Congress on giving rights to African Americans, which they were given the right to vote in the Texas primaries once. He also used the whites in the South as a cover-up for not giving them equal rights. However, he believed in segregation and that African Americans can be treated fairly without having them to be a part of the election system or integrate into their white schools. So he helped expand economic opportunities for blacks and tried to improve the conditions of black schools. He had multiple beliefs of which went with Southern customs as to why they shouldn't be a part of their society, but that they should be their own society apart from theirs. Not only were they neglected rights after the Civil War, but they were also pursued and attacked. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866 to oppose the construction of after the Civil War for the Southern states, and also deny political rights to blacks. Nothing was known about the Klan, but it tended to thrive more where both races were evenly balanced. Terrorism occurred, caused by night raiders who dragged people out of their homes, whipped, and shot them, causing them to flee, most victims being black, but also a few white Republicans felt the terror as well. Another way they caused terror to the African Americans was by the hangings they organized, sending nothing but fear. The KKK were not the only ones, however, who committed these crimes. Emmett Till's murder brought up so much outrage from the nation, mainly for the fact that there was no type of justice served for his murder. He was a young African American who was beat to death by two white men after he had whistled at a white woman. His body was later discovered at the Tallahatchie River in Mississippi on August 31, 1955. The gruesome discovery of Till's body was ordered to be buried immediately, but when Mammy Till, Emmett's mother, heard the discovery, she ordered her son's body to be delivered to Chicago. There, she had an open casket for her son, because she was tired of stuff being covered up. She felt that if the lids of Mississippi would have been opened sooner, then the act towards Emmett Till would have been prevented. His murder was a clear representation of a racial hate crime, which is why the pictures of his disfigured body are constantly used to give evidence to the brutality brought upon African Americans during this time. Racial tension was a major cause, and it inflamed mostly because of northern migration of southern blacks, as they had clustered to industrial centers in 1915, competing whites for jobs, houses, and union wages. The summer of 1919 was named the Red Summer by black leaders because of the violent riots that erupted throughout the nation, which was 26 riots where hundreds of people were injured or killed. The riots arose in early July in Texas and spread to almost every major city in the country. However, it became the most violent in Chicago when an African American adolescent, Eugene Williams, swam near the white side of a segregated beach in Lake Michigan and drowned from whites throwing rocks at him. The police decided to not arrest those who were supposedly responsible for throwing the rocks. Violence then covered the city. Thus erupted the Chicago race riot of 1919. In just 13 days, 38 people were deceased, 23 African Americans and 15 whites. 573 were injured, and 1,000 African American families were left homeless because of property damage. In the years following 1885, there were more lynchings than legal executions in the U.S. Lynching was not only in the South, this was a national problem, as thousands were put to death without a trial by jury, when four-fifths were not even accused by the ones who murdered them. A close observation of the offenses that have caused the lynchings show that race prejudice was the real cause of lynching. African Americans were lynched for trivial crimes, while few white men were lynched for the same reason, such as violating contracts, testifying in court, and shooting at rabbits. This issue was brought into the public's attention by the journalist Ida B. Wells.
Ida B. Wells was brought into this world as a slave born in Holly Springs, Mississippi, then became an orphan at 16. She moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1884, where she started out teaching in rural schools, then moved on to urban schools while she continued to own her education by attending Fisk University during the summers. Ida B. Wells was deeply impacted in 1892 when three men from Memphis who she was close to were lynched. In response, she wrote a scathing editorial directed at these lynchings. Then on a visit to Philadelphia and New York, a mob attacked the offices of the paper she was cautious to not return. As she stayed in the Northwest, she began a campaign against lynching by lecturing and helped create anti-lynching societies like the Women's Loyal Union in New York in 1892. In 1895, Wells published a Red Record, which was a statistical record of lynchings from 1893 to 1895 and a history of lynching since slaves were freed 30 years earlier. In 1895, Wells married Ferdinand Lee Barnett, who founded the city's first black newspaper and was advocate for black rights. Then in 1918, Wells Barnett bravely visited East St. Louis, Illinois, in the midst of race riots to get legal aid for the African Americans who had been targeted by mob attacks. She was against the policy of compromise and accommodation with whites favored by the black leader Booker T. Washington. Instead, she agreed with W.E.B. Du Bois, and Du Bois, along with others, contributed to funding the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1910. However, its mentality was too conservative, so she eventually helped herself apart from it. She had established the first black women's suffrage association, the Alpha Club of Chicago, and participated in suffrage marches. Ida B. Wells Barnett died March 25, 1931 in Chicago, Illinois.
By the 1920s, many lynchings had already occurred, and this angered many like colored women, including Ida B. Wells. They all took a stand to make a difference. This group of women decided to take their proposals up to the Senate. The Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill in 1922 was the bill brought up to the Senate. Senator Shortridge agreed with Ida B. Wells and the other women. However, he thought the Southerners would get bothered and oppose the bill. The bill was voted on by the Senate and passed. It wasn't fully a law yet, but not complete failure. However, not much has changed, so another bill was wanted to be passed. The federal anti-lynching bill was brought up. It wasn't actually proposed until the 1930s when there was enough sponsors. Rallies concerning these bills and the stopping of lynching began to grow. Speakers talked at these rallies to stand up against lynchings that were still occurring. These speakers were sponsored by Chicago's committee and they denounced racial discrimination. In these speeches they spoke on wanting to outlaw the Ku Klux Klan and the beginning of the federal anti-lynching bill, which was still being proposed. They also stood up for the wanting of grant blacks fully citizenship. These were the beginning steps of the civil rights movement.
The civil rights was the solid change the country needed. Although the civil rights movement goes back to the 19th century, it made its biggest impact in the 1950s and 1960s. With this, more and more support came. Many began fighting for their rights and equality. Many protests occurred. By 1965, the movement had pushed the federal government to enact two major pieces of legislation: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark piece of civil rights as it outlawed employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Along with this was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans to exercise their right to vote. The anti-lynching movement was taking a stand in history against all the abuse and neglect that African Americans have faced for so long. All that anger caused racially motivated lynchings, their rights to be neglected and denied, along with multiple riots that resulted in deaths and many injured, until many began to take a stand against these abuses, such as Ida B. Wells, who led an anti-lynching campaign. The anti-lynching movement was more than just going against the illegal and unjust lynching. It was about finally taking a stand for themselves, to fight for their rights instead of putting up with the mistreatment. This was the initial step. The civil rights movement simply continued what it began, making the anti-lynching movement a vital change for the better.